What do you do with a sprawling psychiatric hospital where crumbling ruins stand just steps from active treatment units? Welcome to the campus of the Springfield Hospital Center. Hey, welcome back to the channel, and welcome to Sykesville, Maryland, and the site of the Springfield Hospital Center, formerly known as the Springfield State Hospital. So this area and this campus was once the crown jewel of Maryland's mental health care system. It was built to represent a more humane and self-sufficient approach to psychiatric care. But like so many institutions of its kind, the reality of the situation ended up far more complicated than that. So over the last century, Springfield has mirrored every major shift in how we treat mental illness in America, from philosophical changes to overcrowding and neglect, and then reform, and ultimately the sort of slow abandonment that we see in a lot of these places today. Parts of the hospital, a very small subset of this once giant campus, are still in use today, with patients being treated in active units right next to massive abandoned buildings. So today I thought we'd explore the campus a little bit, talk about its history, talk a little bit about how it got to where it is today, and maybe what we can infer on a broader spectrum about healthcare and mental health care in America today. So we're in a really cool spot here. Start things off, so let's get the show on the road. So we're starting up here at the north end of campus in the Martin Gross section of buildings, which were the original men's inpatient section, I guess if you want to call it that. So the campus was actually created in the late 1800s in response to overcrowding at the Spring Grove Hospital, which we did a video on previously, and I'll put a link up here, wherever it goes to that. But whereas Spring Grove used the giant sort of monolithic type structures that we've seen in a lot of old asylums to house their patients, Springfield here used what was sort of cutting edge at the time, which was a more, called it a colony type setting, where there were smaller structures that were grouped together in close quarters, as opposed to those large buildings with big spaces left in between them. And so this here was one of two sections that were first built as part of that. So this land was actually sold to the state by a former governor whose name eludes me at the moment. Governor Brown, I think. And with it being a farm, the first handful of patients, 20 or 30 patients, were admitted into renovated farmhouses while these buildings were being built. And so we'll see later at the south end of the campus that there's a separate Warfield complex similar to this, built in the same type of style for the women. And so we're kind of going to go in full circle today by ending up down there, but that also has a connection directly to what is going on with the hospital today. And so it'll be kind of full circle while still sort of being able to look at the future. But yeah, these up here were done, I believe these were also done in a colonial revival style or Georgian style. And so they were essentially clusters of buildings that were grouped together, usually four in a group too, in like a rectangle type shape. If you look at both of these sections, the Martin Gross section and then the Warfield section down at the south that we'll see, they look very similar. Interestingly, the Warfield section, which we'll get to, is being renovated and a lot of the buildings are actually currently in use or planned use, whereas these are just left to sit here. So I've tried to do this door's open. Oh wow. I had zero expectation that any of these buildings were going to be open. So I did not bring a flashlight with me or anything. Oh wow. But as you can see here, part of this style of treatment housing was to have each of the buildings connected by these covered porches so patients and staff could walk in between them for different treatments and activities and things. These buildings are incredible. So I was under the impression, I've done as much research. What does that say? Come in, it's safe, no thanks. So I have done a ton of research on this place over the last couple of weeks, couple of months, however long it's been. And one thing that I cannot ultimately figure out is why this cluster here of old men's units were just left to sit here and rot away, whereas the arguably identical Warfield complex are being renovated or included on the National Registry of Historic Places. And the only thing that I can figure out is that these places required a lot more renovations and upkeep than the Warfield ones. So I've gone through years of annual reports from the various commissions that oversaw these hospitals, trying to figure out sort of to do research and all that. And the one thing that I can find is that year after year there were constant requests for money to improve these buildings here, and there was essentially nothing really mentioned, at least not at all on the same level, for the Warfield building. So I don't know if these just ended up as being more costly and so they weren't worth. Is this an active building right there? I thought this was part of the abandoned ones, but... So these were built, by the way, this cluster up here, were built around 1900, 1910. Same with the Warfield buildings that we'll see in a bit. Yeah, look at this. This looks... That looks like a new sign. I think this is closed too. I'm almost positive, but this campus, there's a section north of here too before you actually get to the road, and you go south here and it just continues all the way out there. You can't even really see, you can't even see the Warfield complex from here. It's way down that way. But yeah, I'm not sure what's happening with this building here. But yeah, these two sets of buildings, the men and women's, were built shortly after this place opened in, I believe, in 1896. But yeah, these, like I mentioned, were just left to sit here, rot away, whereas the Warfield ones were not. And so there was a first set of buildings, and I'm guessing it was probably these here, this quad that was built first, and then as the hospital expanded, more buildings were built, and we'll see the same thing in the Warfield complex. And they all were they all were named with different letters. And most of the patient buildings were called cottages, and so you have cottage A, B, C, D, etc. So this would have been cottage H here. You can kind of deduce the order in which the buildings were built by their letterings, and so I don't see a lot of the ones that weren't cottages, like say dining facilities, entertainment facilities, they weren't lettered. But like this here, K, would have been whatever K is, 1 A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. So as we walk to the front side of these buildings here, this campus was something like 1,400 acres at one point, with nearly half of it being dedicated to farming. So similarly to what we talked about with Kings Park, one of the current therapies of the time was to give patients something to do, essentially, and so they would have them work the farm. So this area ultimately became a self-sustaining complex or campus, similarly to Kings Park, where they essentially utilized the free labor of the patients to work the farms, to work the different jobs on campus here, producing food, producing energy, doing laundry, etc., etc. And that's where part of the controversy eventually comes into play when, we can talk about this a little bit later, but patients were, in a lot of cases, not discharged from the hospital even though they were deemed ready to be discharged, because the state and the hospital didn't want to give up the free labor or couldn't afford to hire people to replace the free labor of the patients. And so you had patients that were here for years after they were intended to be and ready to be discharged, solely so that they could be exploited. And so I believe this building is vacant. That building is an admin building. These are either vacant or admin buildings. That building there is a staff development building / admin building. All of these out here on this side are still active in some capacity. I believe there's maintenance, or these two barns here, and then there's a medical building on the other side of this building here. But this gives a pretty good vantage point, I think. So you can see down here, and this is going to be a lot like the Spring Grove situation. So those are active patient buildings down there. You can see the cars and all that, and there's an active building right here, which actually I do think, now that I think this is the building that we saw earlier, the rehab center, I think that is active. I think this is just the backside of it. But we're gonna go down here at some point here and kind of walk around. This is a separate section here called the Clarke complex, that was a separate epileptic colony that was built to house and segregate epileptic patients. That was the rehab building that we saw right there. So yeah, that's one of the open buildings, active buildings, right up next to these abandoned ones. I don't care if you're getting amazing treatment. What does that say? Or what sort of impression does that give you as a patient to be housed in a place where, like I said, even if the treatment is good, they put you right up next to these buildings here. In this case, literally right up next to it. You walk out the back door and it shares a street or a little sidewalk type thing with that. I just feel like it can't instill a lot of confidence or a lot of like a positive vibe to it. So as the epileptic populations grew, along with the hospital in general growing, in each of the men and women's sections. They initially built purpose-built epileptic buildings. There's cottages. There's one at Warfield and there's one up there. I'm not sure exactly which one it was up there, that housed the epileptic patients, kept away from the rest of the population. They were deemed to be sort of having a negative impact on the morale of the population, and so they just put them off in a corner of each of those sections. However, as those populations increased and grew and they outgrew the housing, they ultimately decided that a separate epileptic colony should be built, dedicated entirely for the epileptic patients, where you can see separate from the men's section, and we can't even really, you can kind of see the women's section through here a little bit, but separate from there, just completely cut off. So this complex, and it's actually called the Clarke Circle, was started in 1923 and ultimately finished in 1935. But same sort of idea, following the colony type setup of smaller structures instead of these giant asylums, where patients could feel better about their situation and be closer to different amenities. But yeah, I can't find anything about whether or not these were, I'm assuming they were segregated by gender. And so I believe that right through here, which we'll probably get a look at differently, or we'll get a better look at some point, is the admissions building, the current admissions building. But again, you walk out the front door of the admissions building and you're greeted with this. This is the front of the circle as you would enter from out here. So let's continue to the positive, optimistic outlook approach and say that if they can't tear these buildings down, at least they're doing something relatively nice with them. See, look at this. There's a car coming behind me right now out of the main buildings. How you get back to that building, one of the ways is right past this. I mean, I appreciate that this is landscaped, but this is landscaped because you can see it when you drive to that building. I guarantee you. If this was not seen by visitors and patients, I promise this would probably look different. So let's walk out here a little bit. We can talk about these buildings across the street here, because their situation is pretty interesting. And so up on the hill here, right in front of us, you have the Hubner building, which was built in 1913 and actually served as the central receiving and triage building for patients that were brought here. So when the hospital first opened, patients were sent directly to either the Martin Gross section or the Warfield section, which you can start to see here a little bit, depending on your gender. But as the population continued to grow, they needed a central hub. And so I believe not only did this act as the central admissions hub for patients, it also, but for the hospital here, I'm pretty sure it acted as a central hub for patients across the entire Maryland state hospital system, which encompassed something like 5 different hospitals. And so this one originally was built only for white patients, and then the Crownsville Hospital, which I've been wanting to make a video on for years, was for black patients. And so for some reason at the time, they felt that there was a therapeutic advantage to segregating people not only by gender, but by race. And so this is a cafe, I believe, and similarly to Spring Grove, does not look open. They call it a cafe, but documentation I have calls it a canteen, and I don't know if that's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, or what. The Memorial Canteen building. Okay, so that looks like it's active. Oh, Spring Rock Cafe, just probably not today, I guess. So I'm just trying to show different perspectives from different areas around here. You can see right through here the Clarke Circle Epileptic colony. But then anyway, back to this. So this was built in 1913. A number of years later, there was an addition built on the back of it. And then similarly to the epileptic patient philosophy, whatever you want to call it, situation, I guess, as tuberculosis increased in the state. The hospital originally built, like they built an epileptic cottage, they built a tuberculosis cottage to isolate their tuberculosis patients. However, similarly to the Clarke Circle, the number of tuberculosis patients outgrew their cottage housing. And so they built what they call the T building right next to this building here, which was used to house a larger number of tuberculosis patients. And there was a large grassy area out front that was used for fresh air for the patients, as that was at the time and known, or what they believed to be one of the best treatments. But the T building was built in 1939, and we can just see it cresting over the hill here. But as things began to wind down in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and buildings began to close up, the hospital sold this building to the Maryland State Police. So now this, I believe, is the central training unit for the state police, and you can see what looks out of place here. Colonial Revival, not Colonial Revival. I think it's a medical and surgical building. Maybe that's what this is here. But that's the TB building here in this big open grassy area. It was for patients to come out and get fresh air as part of their treatment. But at some point in the last couple decades, the police have built this addition that joins both of the buildings together. And so this is no longer part of the hospital, but this, I believe, is. And so there are several buildings throughout the area here and throughout campus that have been sold off or leased. And the Warfield complex is actually technically one of those. It's not, whereas the Martin Gross area is technically part of the hospital still, the Warfield complex is not. So we'll talk about that again in a bit, but this whole section up here, those are super cool buildings. I really apparently like this style of architecture a lot. But as we get back here, there's just a number of Maryland State Police training buildings and things of that nature. I think the dorms are back here too for they called cadets, whatever, potential officers in training. So not gonna mess with that, other than just to show from a distance here, I believe those are some of the dorms. All right, so I mentioned things were going okay the first couple decades until the start of World War I, when resources became scarce. That led into the Great Depression. Resources continued to be limited, however, population size continued to grow. This place was built at its height for something like 2,700 patients. But at one point in the late 1940s, early 1950s, it housed somewhere between 3,000 and 3,200 patients. And if you look through old annual reports, like I mentioned before, you can see this progression year after year of this political dance that's done by leadership, I guess, here at the hospital, of heavily implying that overcrowding is starting to happen, that they are understaffed, that we need more space, we need more staff, we need more budget, while at the same time, within the same report, saying that things were going great here. Everything was going great, everyone was treated very well, all of that. And so it's a really weird, like I said, political dance that they were clearly doing, where they don't want to say just how desperate and dire things were getting, even though they knew it, because I'm guessing they were afraid they were going to lose their jobs. But they still wanted to call it out to a certain extent, so that if questioned later on and things sort of came to a head, I'm guessing they could say that they had mentioned something. And all of that kind of came to a head in 1949 when the Sun papers released a collection of reports known as Maryland's Shame. And so as we walk down here towards, next to the Hubner building, towards the Warfield complex, let's talk a little bit about Maryland's Shame in these series of reports. So the claim was that these reports were a bombshell that brought to the public eye all of the issues that we'll talk about in a minute here going on at each of the 5 state hospitals in Maryland. However, there had been reports, both officially and unofficially, for years leading up to that, discussing and divulging the same issues that Maryland's Shame discussed. But for some reason, it did not get the same public attention, public outcry that Maryland's Shame did. And so in my opinion, the claim that the public didn't know about it, that state legislatures and government officials didn't know about it until Maryland's Shame came out, is inaccurate at best. So you can start to see the Warfield complex come into view here. But you can find a copy, a PDF copy of it on the University of Baltimore website. But let me just read you a little bit while we're walking over here about the issues just at Springfield that were called out in this document. Springfield has 49 buildings scattered across 1,400 acres. It houses more than 3,000 insane men and women, and housing is all that most of them get. About 2,700 out of the 3,000 patients are getting no positive treatment at all. There are only 13 doctors on staff for those 3,000 patients, giving each doctor 231 cases per doctor. There's only one girl attendant for 110 women in Cottage C down here. In one dorm, 75 beds are crammed into a space for 50. There's no place for women to keep their personal belongings, so they carry their toothbrush in their hair and other personal belongings wrapped in their handkerchiefs. Everything that they own, they have to carry with them because there's no space. In Cottage E, which we'll see up here, 104 violent women sleep on cots pushed so close together that the attendants can't get between some of them. And this goes on and on and on. Just know that things were very, very dire here. And it took this expose that had been done several times before, but this one finally stuck, I guess, to get some attention. And so these were some of the support buildings that were built in order to help the campus, these ones here, in order to help the campus become its own sort of self-sufficient, self-contained campus, I guess, if you will. I believe this was the power plant here. And right across the street, this is the Warfield complex, which I mentioned is essentially a mirror image of the Martin Gross complex, which we first saw at the beginning. And yet look how different this is. And I really, now that I'm seeing it again, I think a lot of it is landscaping. If you put the giant overgrown bushes and weeds and all that on there, they'd probably look pretty similar. So I guess at the very least that goes to show what a little bit of landscaping can do. But these buildings are on the National Registry for Historic Places, or something along those lines, whatever that organization is called. So there's a lot more extremely detailed information available for all of these. This was the first complex here. So you have this service building right there in the front, and then 3 ABC cottages, patient cottages, around it in that same sort of geometric shape. And these were built again around 1900 or so. But look across here. So there was another building out here, I think it was called the Lane Building. It was way out there. That was torn down, and those townhouses were put up. But I can't find a single thing about what that building's use was or why it was torn down and these were left up. But if you start at this end here, sort of work your way down this complex, the buildings get older. So the oldest buildings are here down until the 1930s or so. Down there, and they started with this cottage style, and then as you can see, they sort of shifted away into a sort of a blended type style of housing. It's not quite the cottagey style. This was the dining hall on the first floor. I believe there was entertainment options on the top. I think there was a movie theater or something along those lines. But as the campus again expanded, more buildings were added. But even though buildings were added, services were not added at the same rate. Staffing was not added, the funding was not there to staff and support the patients that were being housed. And so this was great that they had this colony concept of close quarters, smaller buildings, but they weren't able to man them properly. And so treatment was still a major issue like we talked about. And so we talked a little bit previously about how epileptic patients and tuberculosis patients were kept separate. And that's what these two buildings are up here. And so this building here, which I believe is Cottage G, was the original tuberculosis isolation building for the women's section. And then back here next to this building, there was an old farmhouse up here that was used to isolate epileptic patients. And then once the Clarke circle was built, they were transferred out of here over to those buildings. That old farmhouse was torn down, and these buildings, or this building here, which is this is Cottage H, that's G. This was erected for additional, more current patient housing. And so this section here, similarly to the Maryland State Police situation, was actually sold back to the town of Sykesville. And then Sykesville, I'm not sure if they leased it or sold it to a development company. And they received something like $16 million in tax credits to revamp all of these, to redo them, to get them in shape so that people could use them again. I'm not going to pretend to understand the exact situation going on with that, but there's a big battle between the town and that company because there are claims that they've not been doing enough. And you can see, really, this building is the only one that's clearly, so far, currently occupied. All of these, I believe they had new roofs put on them, but then that's basically it. They still just sit here. And I believe the town wants them cleaned up since they own them now. This building here was Cottage I, pretty sure. And it was the last one that was built in this section. And it was actually built for mentally ill patients, female patients that had infectious diseases. So the piece I haven't quite been able to piece together is if it was things like smallpox or the Spanish flu, or what exactly. I think that would have been past the time. Those would have been passed by the time that building was built, but maybe not. But either way, I'm not sure what infectious diseases besides tuberculosis they were necessarily dealing with at the time. That one looks like it might be occupied. Looks really nice actually compared to these. Look at the windows of these compared to that. So let's walk along the front of these. Oh yeah, so this is definitely, so I wonder what this is. 25 years of something. Exelon Health, some sort of health building here. But there's that colonial revival look. But look, another example, these brand new townhouses here. I mean, brand new. Relatively speaking, these new townhouses. Right across the street from here. So as we start to close things out, this place is important because it represents a major shift, like I mentioned, from those giant asylum type buildings into something more humane. These colony type buildings, the smaller ones, they've got access to more amenities, they've got access to each other. And also, I find it a little hard to believe. I kind of don't fully buy this idea of using the patients to work the land for free kind of thing. I'm sure at some point in the beginning there was some sort of altruistic motive, and they really probably thought that, but then pretty quickly I'd suspect that it became we have free labor, let's essentially exploit that as much as we can. And you can see that, like I mentioned, in the various reports that talk about how there are X hundred number of patients that could have been discharged, but there would be nobody to backfill their positions, and there was no budget being provided to backfill their positions. So they openly discuss it, and yet nothing was ever really done about it until the 60s, I believe, when laws were passed preventing that type of behavior or that type of action. In the 1950s, new medication became available that helped patients more quickly recover and be discharged quicker, reintegrate into society more. There was also a philosophical change that was implemented here around that same time. Look how pretty this is. But anyway, so the whole deinstitutionalization idea that happened in like the 60s and 70s sort of further accelerated patients being discharged at a quicker rate as people became more community and foster care focused, as opposed to bringing patients in and then keeping them here for essentially as long as possible. I'm sure it helped when the laws passed that prevented them from exploiting their patients for free labor. The problem with that is that we never fully set up the community to be prepared to handle that new philosophy. And so again, if you look through the annual reports in the 60s, 50s and 60s, they talk about the churn rate of patients, and patients being discharged is at a significantly higher rate than it was in the prior decades, and that admissions were actually continuing to increase, but the number of residents net were decreasing because they were able to discharge them quicker. The problem with that, and sort of what's in the fine text of some of those reports, is the discussion about readmittance of a lot of those patients who were treated, sent off to foster care, or sort of like the halfway house type things, but then weren't given the resources necessary to fully thrive and ended up relapsing in some capacity or having episodes again, whatever it was that warranted them being readmitted. So as we're passing by this little subsection back here that are the remaining active hospital units, let's talk about where the hospital sits currently. And I have some stats from 2021. You'll have to forgive me for reading them as opposed to having them memorized. But as of 2021, there were 273 budgeted beds in use and 216 average daily patients in those handful of buildings back there. And the really concerning part, showing that we still have not fully figured this out yet, is that all existing hospital units as of 2021 were either at or over capacity. In 7 of the 12 units, every single bed was occupied. So there are an additional, at least again as of 2021, there were 50 additional beds available, licensed for them to use, but either due to staffing or room shortages, whatever it is, they are not utilizing them. So, all these years later, the crazy overcrowding issues, all of that everyone has had to deal with over the decades, all of that, and we're essentially still at a smaller version of where we were previously. Today, Springfield essentially sits somewhere in between. It's a mix of an active hospital, a redevelopment project, as well as empty buildings that there's clearly no real plan for addressing. I think what this place best represents is that while we have come a far way from where we started, we still clearly have a ways to go. So I think we are going to call that about it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this little exploration of the Springfield Hospital Center, formerly known as the Springfield State Hospital. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up. If you want to see more like this, feel free to subscribe. If you do subscribe, hit that little bell. It'll let you know when I upload next. And yeah, I've got a lot more information about this place that I have excluded from here. But if anyone is interested in either a longer form video or just having a chat about it, let me know. I think I'm probably going to do a couple more videos on various other hospitals, hopefully Crownsville, maybe the Rosewood one. I kind of have gone down a rabbit hole and really into this sort of thing. So yeah, anyway, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting as always, and I will see you in the next video. All right, bye.